Well, here's the ground bait. When you're going to mix ground bait, you always need to do it in a round bowl. You don't want any corners, because what happens if you get corners is the dry ground bait gets trapped, hidden away, and it won't mix properly. So always mix ground bait in a shallow round bowl. All right, it's quite simple. You can either use water or other liquid additives to mix ground bait with. If you're going to use water, use lake water. That's my advice, because tap water has got chemicals and things in it, and I think fish are actually quite sensitive to them. Start off by putting some ground bait into the bowl. Don't need to put it all in, because you might be able to take some home if you don't use it all. It's got chemicals and things in it, and I think fish are actually quite sensitive to them. Start off by putting some ground bait into the bowl. Don't need to put it all in, because you might be able to take some home if you don't use it all. So we'll start off with about half a bag. And if you were to use two different types of ground bait mixed together, you would mix them now at this stage. You would put them in dry, and then you'd mix them round until they were thoroughly mixed. Key to mixing good ground bait is to add a small amount of water at a time. If you want to produce really finely mixed ground bait, then an atomizer spray is your best bet. Top matchman will use an atomizer spray every time. But for pleasure fishing, especially for carp, which really will eat an awful lot of bait no matter how much you put in, then you can be a little bit more slapdash about the whole thing and use a container with some lake water in it. So start off by adding a small amount of water to the ground bait and just mix it around. Just add small amounts at a time. Try and keep the ground bait fairly fluffy. You don't want it to be stodgy. What you're after is an even consistency, so you haven't got sort of damp areas, dry areas, very wet areas. You want it all to be the same. So just imagine that your hands are part of a food blender. Try and get a bit of air into the ground bait just by fluffing it around, and we're starting to get there now. This ground bait's getting damp. Just add a little bit more, and at the moment I've now got this ground bait at what I would consider to be the perfect consistency for this style of fishing. As I mentioned before, carp are not too fussy. You can afford to have less than perfect ground bait for carp. If you're bream fishing or fishing for roach, then you probably need to sieve the ground bait, and you should certainly mix it with an atomizer. But for what we're doing, that's ideal. Now, having mentioned that this is perfect, let me just say that this ground bait will now go on absorbing water for a period of possibly 10 or even 15 minutes. So by the time I'm ready to start fishing, I'm going to need to damp it again, because it will actually begin to swell up and start to dry out. So make your initial mix, get it right, and then let it stand, and then top up again. So before I start fishing, I'll probably add another third of a cup of water to this mix just to get it damp. I mentioned that this is perfect for this style of fishing. The amount of water you put in the ground bait will affect very dramatically how it behaves on the bottom. The drier the ground bait, the more it will explode from the feeder. The wetter the ground bait, the stodgier the ground bait, the more it will stick inside the feeder. So for this style of fishing, you want dampish ground bait. You don't want it ridiculously dry, because fishing in deep water, it'll probably explode before it gets to the bottom. But you don't want to over wet it either. You want it to come out of the feeder easily, and once that feeder touches the bottom, you want it to just explode into a ball and release its contents. So damp is ideal for this situation. Later on, we'll look at the complete opposite situation when we go method feeder fishing. But for the time being, look at the way this ground bait works. I can hold it in one hand, it's still in its powdered form. I give it a good squeeze like this, and I've got a ball of ground bait. But if I do this, it all breaks down again, and that's good ground bait. Basically what you're trying to do is make a sandwich. So we start off by putting a plug of ground bait in the bottom. You need to compress it against the palm of your hand. Not too much, you don't want it to be ridiculously tight. Compress it enough so that it's nice and firm, And then add whatever feed you want to put inside. In this case, I'm going to put in some pellets, and then you put in your top plug. So what you've effectively created there is a sandwich. And what happens is when that hits the bottom, the water attacks the ground bait and it explodes out of the feeder. After a short period of waiting, you then twitch the feeder by just making a few turns on your reel handle, and you can draw your hook bait right back into the pile of food that you've now pulled out of the feeder. And that's why the feeder's so effective, because basically you're putting your hook bait in a pile of goodies. Nothing can compete with it for accuracy.